Resource management plan and the Forest Service planning documents need to be, our plan needs to reflect their plans and vice versa.
Yeah, so
go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, so I know that there's the BLM resource management plan. That's sort of clear. I don't know if anybody on the call knows exactly what the document or documents would be on the Forest Service side.
I thought they had a forest plan.
Forest plan, yeah.
They do. They do, but it's quite old. It was published, I think, in the early 90s. It was developed during the 80s, and I think they finalized it in 1990 or 91, somewhere early 90s.
Yeah, same as the BLM.
It's called the Shasta Trinity Land and Resource Management Plan, LRMP, Land and Resource Management, STLRMP. There you go. Gosh, it's magic. I just say it, and there it is. Are you really down on the beach, Jennifer?
Sadly, no. But maybe in 24 more days.
Oh, good.
If I can get a negative COVID test in 24 more days, I might be on a beach.
Oh, great.
Awesome. Did anybody else have anything to add on other plans and documents we need to be incorporating, or partnerships with other organizations we need to consider and introduce?
This is Keith. I was just wondering, so how is this introduction going to look quite a bit different than the last version, the 2016-2020 introduction, or are we just going to build on it?
I think the idea is definitely to use it, but really the whole strategic plan is going to look quite different for this upcoming year. Osley and I are definitely trying to make it more hardy and more detailed, and have like actionable foundations to work on. The past strategic plans, as some of you might know, and Osley mentioned, are kind of just large-scale goals, and we would really like to add more information.
Oh, good. I appreciate that.
And I'm looking at it now. I'm going to add one thing, I think, before we even get into how it relates to other plans, is just coming up with a statement on the intent of the plan. I think that would be like the first part of the introduction, something to work on.
That sounds good. Okay. And I think we were thinking for the description part, that's more kind of just like what's there, describing the literal land and the forest, and the kind of more physical features would be pretty straightforward. But if anybody has anything to comment or add, feel free to speak up.
And I think here we're also looking, because in this we want to talk about some of the ownership and management history, and that's obviously Kathleen and I are both relatively new to the community forest relative to you all with your years of expertise. So if you know of any like books or documents that you have or are aware of that could help inform us on some of this history or these sort of basic facts, and you want to point us to them, that would be very helpful to help us flesh out this section, because I know I don't know, the whole ownership and management history of the forest. Yeah.
I think you need to also have fire history in there. I don't see that.
Yeah.
Good idea.
That's a good one. Yeah. Thanks, Kenny.
Yeah, that can probably be a small section all on its own. So I think with that, we can move on to discussing management objectives, which is going to be probably a majority of the document. So kind of what we have so far, Oz and I have broken out objective categories kind of into forest management, education, outreach, demonstration, and recreation. And so obviously forest management is the kind of main objective we'll be discussing. So within this, we've outlined, and this is all, tentative so far, so feel free to add in momentarily with any thoughts. But we've got forest resilience to various disturbances, water quality and water supply. We've talked about whether carbon sequestration needs to play a role in this plan, long-term sustainable timber yield, native understory diversity and botanical resources, which is not only like native ecologically speaking, but native and of use to the historical tribes in the area, long-term consistent financial returns, and accessible opportunities for the public to participate in management decisions, like being involved in the steering committee. So I think what we'd like to discuss with all of you is just kind of how we're structuring these objectives, if we have forgotten anything, if any of these is, not necessary or deserving of like a whole description like some of the others. And we've also laid out in organizing these objectives that each of them will have a purpose, what a success in this objective category looks like, and how to measure that success specifically. So does anybody have any thoughts on those objective topics so far?
So this is Pat. So I think you've got a lot of it there, but I think you need to reference and make sure that, you have to remember that the whole underpinning of the community forest is the stewardship contracting authorities that the federal agencies use to do the stewardship agreements with the RCD, and there are some fairly specific resource objectives that are in the stewardship authorities. I don't have them at hand right now, but just kind of doing a backstop check to make sure that you've covered those kinds of things, because we want to make sure that we're strongly supporting the continuation of the stewardship authorities and the stewardship agreements.
So maybe in the introduction, in addition to the federal resource management plans, we should reference those agreements. And then just make sure your objectives. You can draw a line between the objectives in the strategic plan and the objectives in the stewardship authorities. And those may be most easily kind of pulled out from the existing stewardship agreements that the RCD and the agencies have.
Pat, this is Keith. Can you think of any that are currently missing, or maybe give an example of one of those benchmarks in that agreement?
That's why I was trying to look them up on the computer right now to see. I mean, I think that you've got it pretty well covered, but I think I don't have them in front of me.
Well, we've got all those on the RCD network, so that's something Oz and I can do, is just look through those and check and make sure we're not missing anything.
So one thing I would change you have long-term sustained timber yield. Well, to me, what that refers to is saw logs. And so I would say forest products yield instead of timber, just because I associate timber yield with logs. And certainly the community is very interested in firewood.
Yeah.
And so that, that could make a difference in what is being managed for, because, as we get more, if this trend in climate change continues, we're seeing a lot of bark beetle killing of the conifers. And I know on my property out here on Indian Creek, I've lost over 200 saw log sized trees, conifers, and fortunately I've got a mixed conifer hardwood forest, so I am looking at managing hardwoods more than conifers in the going into the future.
But Kathleen, Azalea, I'll work with you both on that, kind of crosswalk with the stewardship authorities and this section. Just, let me know.
This is Keith too, and I appreciate Kenneth's comments there, because if you just try and balance it on a sustainable level of what units of measure are you going to use, is it, if it's board foot, you might be actually going backwards with, on paper with mortality exceeding growth. And so that might tell you can't do anything, and you don't want to be in that position. You actually want to achieve your other objectives.
Indeed.
So I think for the BLM, the interesting thing about the timing of this strategic plan is, we're similar to the Forest Service, sitting on a very old resource management plan, which for all intensive purposes, this step-down plan can't really say anything that isn't consistent with that plan, or then this plan requires us to do NEPA analysis, which we don't want to do on it. But my guess is that this plan, since it goes to 2028, correct, we will have a new resource management plan for the Reading field office before this strategic plan is over. So it's kind of the timing there's going to be interesting. So when it comes to things like, for at least for the BLM, what's going to go into long-term, sustained timber forest products and things like carbon sequestration are going to be real vague for us, because what's in our current plan now, the words carbon sequestration don't exist in the plan from like the early 90s.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Jen. And I think, especially with the carbon sequestration objective, you can see we've got a little question mark here. We weren't sure if that is something that really belongs in this plan, if that would be acceptable to the community. So I think specifically on carbon sequestration as well, if people have thoughts on that, or if, like you were saying, Jen, if that's just going to be a no-go because it's not already captured in our federal resource management plans, we can have a conversation about that as well.
Yeah, we just have to walk that line where we're not making decisions, and this is a strategic plan, so it shouldn't make really site-specific decisions anyway. We should be doing that in the operating plan if we're going to continue to do those kind of yearly. I would call it operating plan. I can't remember. But we just want to make sure we're not committing ourselves to something here that then can contradict us, or committing ourselves to something so much that someone can come back and say, we should be doing a actual NEPA analysis on this plan. Because between us and the Forest Service, you'll never get through that.
Unfortunately. No, that's all great stuff to point out, and things we will definitely be keeping in mind.
This is
Yeah, I
Keith.
think that,
This is Keith. Do you think you could evaluate carbon sequestration without making it be a driving principle? So you're just monitoring it rather than having it be one of the a goal necessarily. So if you don't specify it as a goal, it should be just for information purposes only. If the metric is reasonably cost effective, then it doesn't hurt to collect that information, even though it's a new topic. It's not very new, certainly politically.
Right.
Maybe it actually fits under the forest resilience, in some way. You could be looking at it there as just a tool for understanding forest resilience, and not have it as its own sub-objective.
Right, and I think we do calculations on our timber harvest proposals that do greenhouse gas calculations, and I'm sure many people have methodologies for calculating that, but with the carbon banking and all that sort of thing, I know that it's a common practice nowadays, not that I know all the math behind it.
Yeah, I think Kenneth and his guys have done some of that too.
oh, that's our bread and butter anymore. Although I'm not the guy to talk to about it. Paul Harper is the guy who does the analysis. I was a field forester, and so I collected data that was used in that way. But in regard to the LRMP, I don't recall anything about carbon sequestration in that document, which I think the Forest Service is still operating under, possibly with some modifications due to the Northwest Forest Plan. That is an old document. I actually wrote part of the Citizens Alternative to that document, and I wrote pretty much the timber section, and I'm sure that I know that the Forest Service has not been meeting their annual outputs of timber on the Trinity side of the forest. So the document is quite old and really is supposed to have been revised after 15 years, and it's been 30 plus years. So it's not up to date. As far as I know, they may have made some internal changes to it that I'm not aware of, but what we developed back then is not what's being practiced now.
And I'll kind of jump in on that. I agree that document is so old at this point that it's almost a legal liability to use it.
Mike, do you know if in that case, does that mean that an update is coming imminently or just in the near future? Is that something we should be talking with the Forest Service about during the strategic plan process?
Yeah, I would highly push for pushing us, because it's a very limited ability to get anything done anymore, and we need squeaky wheels to help us determine what we put our efforts into. There's just not enough of us to get stuff done. So the squeaky wheel gets the oil, and this is something that's needed to get done on many different levels. So, pressure from this group would be beneficial for sure.
My recollection is that Region 5 was starting to do their land and resource management plan updates in the Southern Sierras. They had decided that, Shasta Trinity would be part of the zone that would be taken up with all the other forests covered by the Northwest Forest Plan. And as far as I know, they're still woefully behind on the Sierra ones, and I don't think they've even got a viable schedule right now for the update of the Northwest Forest Plan forests. Originally, it was supposed to be 2022 or something like that, but I'm sure it's not.
Our
I
wilderness
think-
management plan is also behind schedule. It was due in 1994, and we still don't have one of those at all. So, our ability to get these documents done is poor track record.
You're just trying to outdo Trinity County with this general plan update that the general plan goes back to 1978.
Yeah, and I think that's something Oz and I have talked a little bit about keeping our eye on too. Should the general plan update, have anything relevant to forest land or fire protection? I think it's like Mike was saying, it's also an opportunity to get that information in there.
Yeah.
So in terms of these questions of like these outdated plans that are maybe currently going to be updated or hopefully going to be updated soon, I guess maybe this is too vague a question, but I kind of am trying to figure out how much, like we don't want to be so sort of tied back by that then this document becomes meaningless. Like we want to be able to think big and make a vision for the community forest regardless of what other people are doing. But then like Jen, you were saying like we don't want to then put ourselves into an awkward situation where we've overstepped our boundaries. So I don't know if people have ideas about that. Like maybe there's a way that we can write this as a vision and with a caveat that we'll update it as these plans get updated and we'll change it to fit, but that we don't necessarily have all of that information now and I don't know.
So honestly, now you know why the current strategic plan was kept so general.
Absolutely.
Because, that way, you don't, it's broad enough that it can cover changes, by other agencies. But, so we're just going to have to walk that fine line, I think, and it's the best we can do.
Well, yeah, what about making it more specific? Just because, I feel like it's obviously a trade-off.
You just have to, you just identify that, this current plan is, is reflective of, plans dated such and such, such and such and such and such. And if we've got to go back in and update our own, then we have to. I mean, I think that's just the reality of a multi-organization effort.
Yeah. So, I mean, is it appropriate to put things in that we think are important and then say, we'll go back, when we have the new information of the new BLM RMP, for example, and edit this? Or is that strike people as a bad idea?
Well, from the BLM perspective, we're bound by what's in our resource management plan. So that's our legal guiding document. So, any plan that we do has to tier to that. Our plan is really old and very general. So most of what we do is pretty easy to tier to that really old, broad, general plan. But everything has to tier to that. That is our guiding document. If I can't make it tier to that document, I can't do it without an amendment, which doesn't happen very easily. So, we can say anything we want in here. Theoretically, I just can't actually do it. So I don't think we want to say stuff that we can't do. And I don't know. I haven't seen anything in here yet that causes me concern. Like I said, other than, we need to deal with carbon sequestration in another manner, but I think we've already worked through that. A lot of it, in the timber yield kind of forest products, depending on how specific we get there, I think it's going to be real easy for both the Forest Service and the BLM to not be probably consistent with that, because our plans are, like I said, really old. In reality, the only person that's going to get an updated plan between now and 2028 is probably the BLM. I don't see the Forest Service pulling that off with that many forests if they're actually going to do that in that time period.
So, and you mentioned this a little bit, but do you, maybe it's too early to know, but do you know, you said you can't add anything to the new RMP that contradicts the past RMP, but do you know if it's going to stay in the sort of broad stroke spirit of the current RMP, or is it going to become more specific? Do you know that at this point, Jen?
Oh, it's going to become more specific. We started this 4 years ago. We got 2 years in and then took a pause because we had about 25% of the Reading field office burn in one fire. So we took a pause, and now we're starting to redo all of our data so that we can kind of come back out of pause land. But yeah, it'll have to be more. The format of the RMPs from the early 90s don't meet the like standard requirements for resource management plans now. So, I mean, our current management plan, the actual like, not taking out the EIS part of it, but the actual document is like, well, I don't know, maybe a half an inch thick, quarter an inch thick. Like, there's no way that the new one will be that generic. So, and there's lots of changes. I mean, under the old resource management plan, I mean, the Weaverville Community Forest is available for disposal. Like, I don't see that being the case in this next go round. So we didn't even really draft any specific anything for the community forest, because as far as we were concerned, the greater we, it was a land, parcel that was going to be up for disposal to another entity. So I would think that, however we deal with it in the next RMP, which was part of the discussions we were having, is whether that, does it get some sort of special designation? If it gets a special designation at all, then we'll have to come up with some site-specific objectives for management of the community forest.
And so is there potential that this plan can inform the RMP, or does it only go the other direction? Like the strategic plan we're working on.
No, I mean, I would say if there's information that comes out of here and with the community forest group that, would help us inform, what proposal we want to put forward for, different alternatives to manage the community forest. So it can go both ways. Ultimately, when it's said and done, what's in the RMP will take precedent over any other plan we've got on the books.
Gotcha. Thank you for all that information. Very helpful.
This is Keith. I was wondering go ahead, Bob.
Thanks, Keith. So this might be a good time to get my 2 cents in. So to segue off what Pat brought up before Jennifer spoke, when I saw the agenda for today's meeting, I wasn't happy with it at all. In the past multiple updates of the strategic plan, we've gone through page by page around the table, which we can't do these days, unfortunately, and assessed it and suggested changes and kept it general so that we weren't tied down, restricted by it. And I thought it was a great process, and I am much happier with that than with this. And that's probably the end of my whining for today. Thank you.
So this is Keith. Along those lines, maybe, but being new, I like the new approach simply from the standpoint of having some metrics of success. It seems like it gives more of an evaluation opportunity, and it doesn't have to be, these are the only ways we'll measure success, but this is the portion, and I hope it's not problematic, where you do some fire modeling to evaluate, are you achieving any kind of your objectives? And then the forest health assessment, you can get into the weeds of what that would look like, but there's some things you can measure, and if we can measure something, it would sure be helpful to be able to report that we're accomplishing something instead of being too general. And maybe when you get down to it, you do more specific things on the operational side, but I think when things get stifled, then it seems like how are you doing becomes a question of, I don't see any change, and that if that's the only measure of success, then people could lose interest.
And just to kind of respond to both of you, Bob and Keith, thank you. I think the one thing you brought up, Bob, just being able to review as a group, that is kind of the idea and the goal for the next few months. So the strategic plan update we're aiming to publish in May next year. So we've got quite a bit of time, and we'll be doing these monthly steering committee kind of strategic plan committee meetings, and every month we're going to come with you with whatever we have drafted so far, questions we might have for the group or feedback we're seeking, and present the opportunity for the steering committee and any new public members to ask questions and provide their independent feedback. And we're planning on structuring that. Maybe this is a good time to share. We're planning on structuring that kind of in objective chunks. So next month in January, we're going to be focusing on the forest management objectives, and then into the spring, we'll start talking about kind of the more social things, education, recreation, and then really diving into funding opportunities in the last month or so of drafting. And if that model seems like it's not working or it's too limiting, maybe we can edit that along the way. But this is kind of our first idea to break out the meetings and focus our conversations. But so hopefully that even though we can't be around a physical table, we can still kind of do that round table discussion on the drafting as we go. And I think on the general versus specific topic, our goal is just to make the strategic plan more like a typical forest management strategic plan, which for other community forests and other forest land in general are usually pretty lengthy. You know, they're more like a resource management plan. So we kind of have those as our model right now. But obviously, you know, we have things like the AOPs, which are extremely specific. And I think we're hoping to kind of talk about the model of those too today. But so we're not getting down to project level, granular, anything like that. But I think we do want to hit somewhere in the middle is our idea. Alrighty. Well, it sounds like.
Are there some sub-objectives below D that we can look at?
Yeah, sure. So the other ones we've got are the native understory, plant resources, consistent financial returns, and accessible public management opportunities.
So when you wrote native understory, diversity, and botanical resources, I'm assuming that includes kind of the flip side, which is invasive species, because there are some significant problems with broom, you know, in some parts of some sub-watersheds and that sort of thing. So as long as that you thought that's part of that analysis or that effort, I think that's cool.
Yeah, I can add that specifically, but I think we had kind of assumed that would go in there too.
And I bring this up because I remember reading Osley's draft thesis report, where one of the things that she identified is that the community forest has been lacking in its outreach and information gathering from native peoples. And so where would that fit in?
Yeah, so that is definitely part of this. I tried to mention earlier, this is not only like native ecologically, kind of revegetation and things like that, but also one of, the things that Osley identified in her thesis work was that the native tribes wanted more of their like traditional use plants, which are largely understory plants, to use for food and other cultural uses. So that would go in here too.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, the way I would think about it is like when we filled out only that first like disturbance resilience. We kind of filled out to give you guys an example of what we mean by vision of success and metrics of success. But I think those kind of things in terms of, okay, we want native understory diversity. How do we do that? What does that look like? In my mind, like those type of like including tribal input or would go into like the vision of success, or potentially even part of the metrics of success for like sub-objective E here. So yeah, I think it's definitely in there for me, even if it's not in the title. It would be part of what would be considered a successful way of doing that. How do we know whether we're doing a good job maintaining our botanical resources? And to know that, we should consult with people, all different types of people. So.
And as a bit of a history thing, and you know, everybody that was involved in the original stewardship effort with BLM is long gone from BLM, so nobody's involved anymore. But one of the reasons we didn't include that side of cultural resources in our original strategic plan and that sort of thing was because there was an issue at the time that you know, the local tribal folk are not federally recognized, and BLM didn't want to increase or improve their arguments to become federally recognized. Now, that may be long gone and not an issue anymore, but and Jennifer probably could address that, but that was an issue originally.
Yeah, I don't think we're there currently. We have been consulting with the non-federally recognized tribes on projects that we do.
Okay, cool.
You know, kind of we treat them basically the same. So I don't think that's an issue anymore.
Okay.
Good to hear.
We've come into the new ages maybe a little bit.
Yeah. Okay.
That's good to know. Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay. Are there any other objectives people might want to add, just in thinking about economic, social, environmental needs that the community has?
Can you scroll back up again so we can?
Definitely. Maybe I can zoom out here and try to
have short morning memory.
So kind of as a recap, we've got forest resilience to various disturbances, water quality and water supply. We've already kind of talked about maybe filtering carbon sequestration into other objective areas, sustained timber yield or forest product yield, native understory and other vegetation issues, consistent financial returns, and accessible public opportunities.
What about wildlife?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can add that in kind of.
And that's, you know, what made me initially think of that is that the current county general plan has much of kind of the Weaverville Road area identified as critical winter deer range, which is kind of crazy. There's so many deer in Weaverville. But anyway, wildlife certainly would be an issue. Oftentimes, it seems like the NEPA documents that the Forest Services use to do vegetation management in the basin talks to the improvements to wildlife habitat and that sort of thing.
Yeah, the Trinity deer herd had a lot of their habitat displaced when the Trinity Lake when the dam was put in, and a lot of area was inundated. So the head of the wildlife herd, the deer herd, said, "Hey, they've got a lot of roses down there in Weaverville," so they moved down into Weaverville, and that's become very important habitat for deer.
And inside the fire district, it's very safe habitat.
This is Keith. I was wondering if where we were thinking of putting in the previous strategic plan, there was quite an emphasis on watersheds in particular, and a lot of that focused on obviously water quality, but erosional processes as well. So maybe, because a lot of times a metric for an opportunity for reduction in contributions, if there is one perceived, might be an evaluation of roads and the contributing points of sediment. So I just wondered where that fit in here, because I know there was some efforts to target roads that might be contributing in a negative way.
Keith, do you think that could potentially maybe broaden the water quality and water supply?
I think that's where it belongs, right? I think because that's what the greatest impact is. I mean, it could be upslope impacts too. We don't like slides, even if they don't meet or they don't fall into the water course. But, if we're contributing to it in a way that promotes a negative aspect, we want to be aware of that. And a lot of times what we do is we'll do a watershed evaluation of the road network and identify the highest risk areas and target those for upgrade or improvement.
Yeah, I think we were thinking about roads as definitely fitting into, and just like, all roads especially, but all that fitting into the water piece. But now thinking about it, I could also see as a separate sub-objective, not only, you can't talk about water, you can't talk about water quality and metrics for that and stuff without talking about roads. I think that much is clear. So I think that definitely my mind is going there, but also just listening to you talk, Keith, and maybe just soil conservation as a sub-objective of its own, even if it's not contributing, if erosion isn't contributing to a decrease in water quality, maybe just that top soil loss and those slumps and stuff are also something we're trying to avoid, like you said, even if they're upslope, upland, and they're not affecting the water. So maybe just as a separate sub-objective, soil conservation and whatever, and thinking about what that means to us on the community forest.
I agree. I think that's important because, wildfire and the ability to handle fire in a way that doesn't have significant consequences. I mean, I just came back from some of the August complex, and I mentioned this before to other folks, but when you let it build up and you have such an intense fire that burns in the ground so deep, I'm seeing erosional processes that are disappointing to me based upon the loss of structure. If the slope is steep and you have too hot of a fire, you're going to have some negative consequences that aren't meeting your desired objectives.
Yeah, well, certainly the productivity of the soil is, I think, should be a prime objective because, everything grows in the soil, and if you degrade the soil, you're going to degrade your vegetation and everything else.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so it sounds like that is one to add in. And I maybe should have shared this earlier, but we are also specifically thinking about the actions and treatments that would fall within these objectives, and kind of part of the metrics and the strategy behind making sure that objectives are accountable and we can complete them. We've kind of outlined some various like forest management actions that will be described as part of these objectives. So we'll be talking about commercial timber harvest, non-commercial thinning, prescribed burning, and then kind of as part of that water bit, stream channel restoration, invasive species removal, native plant seeding and planting, roads, and then of course for everything, monitoring, analysis, planning. So additionally, if there are other actions that we've left out or anything, feel free to comment on that as well.
Do we need a set of actions or a category of actions that deals with outreach and education?
Yeah, so I know I've mentioned that outreach and education is one of our objectives, and we've kind of just been looking mainly at the forest management things. But below we also have this. Oh, gotcha. The second main objective as education and outreach, and these are kind of the treatments, the management that would go into that, and then recreation as well. Okay, sounds like maybe we've gotten through the majority of the management objective information and discussion. Any outstanding thoughts, questions, comments?
I actually have a question for Keith, if you don't mind me jumping in. You were discussing the watershed evaluation and prioritization that needs improvement, and said that you wanted to see an ability to handle fire in a way that doesn't have significant erosion consequences, and that the August fire, you're seeing some really disappointing results. I mean, other than preventing the fire, can you tell me what would meet that objective?
So I guess what I'm thinking is, and it's hard when you don't have control of someone else's screen, but I know you had on there a listing of desired stand conditions. I think if you develop, let's see, where's that? Right there, desired stand structure. I think if you are able to identify your desired stand structure, I think we could come up with one that allows for more, it's not fragmentation, but it's more compartmentalization, so that you have some places that have different level of fire rather than having very intense for very long periods of time, driven by things other than just slope, so shaded conditions, large tree conditions, small tree conditions that aren't too extensive to where you have a very large area that all looks the same. So I think the fire intensity can be managed by a variety of stand structures throughout the watershed. That's, I think, a good goal to have. And then when the fire happens, it's not a surprise. And then having fire prescriptions that the Forest Service, I think, I know working with Tim a little bit, they've got some good prescriptions that need to be implemented as well. And if you have prescribed fire, then you don't have the conflagrations that I guess I saw.
Awesome. And I wanted to add in kind of a little bit of the information we gathered on community needs from the community meeting. So, like has just been brought up, just from the group of people we had in attendance at the community meeting, fire resilience seemed to be relatively universal as kind of the number one management priority that people are concerned about. And then native biodiversity as well. So the native plants and the native wildlife components we've also already talked about. in kind of our small group discussions, there was also a concern to make sure that the forest products that we do get out of the community forest end up at the local mill. So there was some speculation about whether or not that's happened in the past. And then making sure that our objectives and various forest uses are complementary. So using trails as fire breaks, thinking about using native plants as part of general forest health and fire prevention, and focusing on fire prevention rather than suppression, which we've also just talked a little bit about. So that is kind of some of the snapshot of what the community is thinking.
This is Keith. Can I address the concern for making sure that the harvests go to a local mill? And since I'm not the local mill, I hope you take this appropriately, is that for one, the local mill here cuts only certain species. They only cut specific sizes. They do not have dry kilns, so they can't handle burned wood. So just as a, they obviously have a haul advantage based upon their location, and that's significant. But at the same time, and they're an efficient mill, so it's not an outdated mill. But just be aware that anything that goes on the market, whether it's from the Forest Service or other private or the community forest, let's just say, for example, they don't cut pine. They don't cut small pine, but if there's small pine that ends up on the market and it goes somewhere else, that offsets their need elsewhere so that they don't have to go elsewhere to go, we don't have trucks passing each other on the highway going in opposite directions. So more available keeps them afloat, because you're not going to just plant white fir and Doug fir, which is what they cut, and you're not, you might want to make sure it doesn't burn up, but if they can't cut it because it has bugs in it, then you're stuck. And if that's the only outlet, just don't look at it as a negative if it goes outside all the time.
Yeah, definitely. And I think
that's probably an educational thing that we as a committee need to make sure the community understands better.
Yeah, I agree.
Because
Understanding that when the Forest Service or BLM put a project out to sell, that they have some limitations on how they can structure that, and they can't say, and you got to take your trees to this mill or that mill.
Right, because I would say this too, is we sell logs to Trinity River Lumber, and so if the situation is appropriate, I don't mind having healthy competition around, and I think they are healthy competition.
Yeah, we can't actually, from the BLM perspective, we can't do anything to influence where it goes. So, we put out the sale. I suppose there are maybe ways in how the sale is structured or whatever, but as far as, our contracting regulations, it sells to who it sells to.
I think the closest BLM to doing, was when you did negotiated sales
Correct.
with the RCD and left it to the RCD to determine who they were going to sell the trees to.
Correct, but those have to be less than 250,000
Right.
board feet.
Right.
There was some other things happening there in the past, but
Right.
the actual regulations say less than 250,000 board feet. So we can do that. They just makes the sales pretty small.
Well, yeah.
Well, I think another piece of this that I don't see addressed here is biomass. And if you're talking about silvicultural prescriptions that are leaving the larger trees, more fire resilient trees, and taking out smaller trees to lower the fuel hazard, what do you do with ones that are not the commercial size to go to a mill? And that's been a problem all over, how to take care of that. And it's been proposed to put in biomass plants, and that seems to go nowhere, because I think primarily because there is no consistency of supply to interest anyone to put in a biomass plant.
I mean,
So I think that's,
yeah, go ahead,
go
Kevin.
ahead.
I
No, go
say
ahead.
even to the extent of the watershed center's attempt to have a commercial firewood processing they couldn't sustain that with supply.
Yeah, exactly. And we manage 14,000 acres up on South Fork Mountain, and we were willing to supply them with fuel, but that didn't work out. I guess because of the Holocaust. I'm not sure all why. I wasn't involved in that whole process. I think the cost of getting that to them, the haul cost plus our management costs, you have to go through a timber harvest plan to sell that stuff. I think it was prohibitive for them to get it at a price that made it viable for them.
Kenneth, this is Keith. I just wanted to mention that in light of, because I've been looking at this problem too, and even where the haul costs are comparable, we're competing with the diminished infrastructure such that even with subsidies, our land is steeper and more difficult to get the material out, so that if they have an option, they're going somewhere else where either the roads are better or it's not as steep or that sort of thing. So even with the supply out there right now, the limited infrastructure is having those folks pick and choose. It's like a buyer's market type of situation. They can pick and choose where they go. Even when I have my friends, they don't want to come here because of the added cost and then the lack of consistency, like you said.
Yeah, I know I did some work with Roseburg Forest Products on their land, and they were doing a lot of biomass utilization from understory thinning and pre-commercial thinning, and they had biomass plants close enough that they were often able to either make a profit or break even on those things. But as you say, a lot of their lands were pretty flat and good road systems, and they had biomass plants within 20-25 miles of where they were operating.
Yeah, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the only way that we could actually like break even or better on electricity generation from biomass would be like if the mill here in town started running their cogen plant. And I think I remember what Alex Cousins was saying is that they have the capacity to do it, but they don't do it because just the cost of running it is too much. So that's one thing I've been looking at. I know the Forest Service has some funding opportunities to help fund biomass utilization, but from what I've seen, a lot of it is to pay for like capital costs of building new infrastructure rather than actually like subsidizing the operation costs, which is unfortunate because that's my understanding. And again, correct me if any of this is wrong, but my understanding is like that's what we need. So if anybody hears of opportunities we could potentially propose to Trinity River Lumber, I think that would be definitely a game changer for biomass in the Weaver Basin.
I've got some fuel break biomass I could give them.
Okay, and I think the last thing on our kind of management topic of discussion was just trying to gather any other ideas people might have on making sure that community input really is captured in the strategic plan. If there's ways to make sure we're continually providing opportunities for people to talk to us and get involved. or if there's like one specific action we can do right now, kind of at the beginning of the process, and just further the conversation that we started at the community meeting. People have engagement ideas.
This is Keith. I'm wondering if we could get, we all have access to the previous strategic plan, which I think Bob references as more of a general document. And then we have what you're showing on the screen here, and maybe others have already looked at it, your outline. Maybe if in the intervening time we could try and flesh some of that out with our own ideas, that maybe just a brainstorming idea to, if you were to come up with your own purpose for one of those categories, then maybe it'll be entirely off the wall, but it might be different, and it's something people could do as homework instead of, since we're not all in the same room.
Yeah, that's something that I think what we were going to mention at the end of the meeting is that this document that you're seeing with our outline in it is actually a Google document, which means that we can share it and make it so that any of you could comment on it. And that was going to be part of our idea, that between these monthly meetings, you'll be able to access this document and leave comments like that, like write out your own purpose statement and put it in there. Or if you see something that we've written, you could put a comment saying, I don't think that's right, or you should reword it this way, or this won't fit into our RMP, or whatever those type of comments are. So that type of ongoing written interaction with the document is something that we hope you guys will want to do. So thanks for bringing that up, Chief. That's definitely something we've been thinking about.
And even along those lines, I think, we can put that on our website and put it on our social media and things like that. But that also has limited reach. So I think if you all can share with your networks in whatever way is possible, but again, if you just have other kind of ingenious involvement ideas, feel free to chime in.
Let's leave it at creative rather than ingenious.
Sounds good. No pressure. Okay.
So I would think that you talked about the Google Docs, and probably not everybody here uses that or is familiar with it. So recognize that kind of the technical online skills of your subcommittee is quite varied. So providing it different ways might be helpful too.
Yeah. If anybody, we can send out the information about how to get to this document. If you have an internet browser and you know how to use Microsoft Word, it shouldn't be anything too surprising. But I don't want to speak for Kathleen, but if anybody is having issues or confused how to interact with Google Docs, I'm happy to field phone calls and emails and help people use that.
Yeah, definitely. So this is basically an online live Microsoft Word document.
Yeah. So that's the thing, is not all of us have, the same capacity of our internet to do lots of live online kind of stuff. So, and we have limitations on how much we can use data-wise in a month and that sort of thing. So it's just a little trickier, when you've got people in outlying areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I would say that certainly if you can Zoom, you can definitely use Google Docs. It's not as big of a draw as something like Zoom would be. I don't think it's even close to that. So, I want to be respectful of people's internet capacity. So again, if you're having issues, feel free to reach out. There's always the option of copying this into an email or into a Word doc if that works better for you.
That would be helpful.
I would say it's just really difficult for us to track if we send out 20 different Word docs and people are individually editing those and then sending them back to us, that makes it pretty burdensome to try to figure out who's saying what. So maybe if it's okay, if you think it's not unfair, Pat, I might leave it at, let me know if you want me to do that, and rather than the default being that I send out a Word doc to everyone.
Okay.
That's okay. And then the default, for those of you who are able to use the Google Doc, I think that's just a more collaborative way, because you won't double up on other people's comments. You'll be able to see what someone has already said, things like that. And then the Word doc will be a backup for people who maybe aren't able to access the Google Doc. Does that seem fair to you, Pat?
Sure.
Okay, thanks for that input, though. Good to remember.
You swung him over just by using the word collaborative. I think you got him hooked.
Yeah, we'll let you know that an hour of Zoom is 1 gigabyte of download, and so when you only have a limited amount of downloading you can do in a month, you got to pick and choose.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and that's kind of part of what we want to address is, some people don't have internet at all, or some people don't have a computer, and we want to make sure we're providing or thinking, brainstorming ways to involve anybody that wants to be involved. So that's definitely good to bring up. And yeah, if there are specific ideas or suggestions that we may not have thought of to include everyone, we definitely want to hear it.
Also, I just thought of this. There may be a way to come borrow our internet at the ICD if you want to look at this document or something like that. There may be a way, so you can reach out to me about that too.
Okay.
Alrighty. So I know we've been on for about an hour, and if people have other commitments and things, that's understandable. That was definitely
a commitment to my breakfast.
Well, we definitely want to make sure you eat, Kenneth. But that was probably going to be the majority of the meeting. So we're on the tail end of things. As far as kind of how specific to get with the document, Oz and I have been going back and forth about, if we need to kind of discuss potential project areas, not specific projects, but and how a new strategic plan framework may work with AOPs. I think this has been the trickiest part for us to try to figure out exactly what everything will look like. I don't know if you have a better way to introduce that, Oz.
Yeah, I think the real question is, how should the strategic plan relate to the annual operating plans, the AOPs? Because neither Kathleen nor I have been part of the process of developing an AOP, but we've obviously seen the archived ones or the current one. And I think in my reading of the old strategic plans and the old AOPs, there's definitely a disconnect between them. And I know Amelia did a lot of work on the last AOP, making that connection more clear by grouping the projects in the AOP by objectives from the strategic plan, which is helpful. And I think we're trying to think creatively about moving more in that direction of making there be a strong connection between what we said was our objective and our strategy, and then what we're actually doing each year. And so we're trying to think creatively about how we could maybe make that connection. So, for example, one thought we thought of, and just let me know if you think this is like crazy or bad idea, but we were like, what if instead of an annual operating plan, because I know a lot of the federal agency projects are, at least my perception, again, correct me if I'm wrong, is that they're kind of known pretty far in advance, since NEPA takes a while. Oftentimes, those projects are in longer term plans already. So maybe even having an operating plan that extends multiple years, but that we revise every year. And those are all directly linked back to objectives, rather than, I don't know, and maybe it's because I haven't been through the process of making an AOP, but it just seems very disconnected. Does anybody have insight into that or want to correct me or?
Osley, to the best of my knowledge, the projects that end up on the AOP are oftentimes on the AOP for a number of years. I don't know that they're necessarily like tied back, but they do say, when expected work is to be done, and they oftentimes will rotate, from year to year or continue to persist depending on, progress on those projects. But I've never seen, like a true or direct connection between, what those projects are as to how they relate to the strategic plan's objectives. Usually they're talked about and discussed within the steering committee guides that process of what's on there, but they typically, are projects that by and large are coming down from the land managers, both the BLM side and the Forest Service side, and that that there's some other ones that do get in there, say through us, that are sort of not directly connected to larger NEPA or environmental compliance documents, but they do tend to be sort of in alignment or sort of run through approval of the steering committee, generally speaking. Pat or Kenneth or anybody have any other comments on that?
I think that's pretty accurate, Kelly. I mean, it's called an annual operating plan because one is done every year, but it is, a project may first show up on the annual operating plan as a planning project to do the design and the specialist work to lead to the NEPA, and then it works its way to be, with an implementation, a goal of implementation in year whatever it is. And then as projects get completed, then they come off of the annual plan. I think we have to continue to have annual operating plans because I'm pretty sure that it's a requirement of the stewardship agreements that the RCD has with the agency. So one way or another, I think, and I would also agree that they do lack linkage to the strategic plan.
Yeah, and those AOPs, as part of the deliverables for the stewardship agreements, the master stewardship agreements, they're signed off by the district manager, the RCD as the steward, and who usually. I think it's who, like Jennifer would sign off on them, and then usually it's the line officer for the Trinity River Management Unit that I think signs off on them as well.
I think another important piece of those annual operating plans is they attempt to identify funding sources, including the funding sources that the RCD or the Watershed Center bring to the project, so that it's not all, money that is retained receipts or appropriated dollars from the agency. So I think that's an important piece of that, I think, and an important piece of what the community forest is all about is leveraging the monies, the retained receipts, and other federal funding sources to capture non-federal money.
Yeah, and so like as a direct linkage, like I said, I think by and large that's it's more of a vetting process than anything else, and we had brought up specific projects as we're coming in based on wherever they were being funded from. like Pat was saying, but then, vetted through the steering committee, as to, whether or not that's an appropriate, goal and something that we, collectively want, to move forward with. So it's not directly related to the goals or, whatever, but it's certainly, runs through that gauntlet before it actually ends up on the AOP.
Yeah, so thank you both. So yeah, I think maybe what I am thinking would be, it sounds a little different from the process of the AOPs. Kathleen, maybe you could scroll down to the planning portion of the document, or the project portion. But I was thinking maybe like the pre-AOP, it would be a useful exercise to come up with as a group, rather than this process where it's a project that I don't know who's rather than a project that's created by federal agencies and then vetted by this group or the steering committee. What about the process of the steering committee as a group deciding what kinds of projects we want to see, and then having that guide to future AOPs? So we created this idea that may or may not be the way to do it, but we were thinking basically this type of tool that could help us think not about specific projects, like we want to do a harvest called this on these acres, but rather like a commercial timber harvest in general, or a native plant seeding project in general, and then try to think about as a group how the steering committee values those things, how much they cost and stuff, how much we want to really focus on those type of activities in the next 8 years, so that we have, like kind of a different process for us to think about that maybe over the next 8 year span, what we want to do, and then have that inform what actually gets planned. So sort of like group up rather than federal agency down to the group, if that makes sense.
That's a great idea. I think it's, it would be definitely a separate planning process and a separate document than the AOP, because the AOP is actually projects that are actively being worked on, essentially, to some extent or another, whether that's implementation or in the planning process or whatever. But yeah, and that would definitely be an easier way to go about aligning projects that do meet the goals of the strategic plan as they're being, basically designed and developed, and then brought forward, and then we figure out, okay, well, how is this funded? So
okay, and definitely, we were thinking it would be a section of the strategic plan, and then maybe it could help inform the AOPs. But it'd be great to hear from someone from an agency, like if this is realistic in any way, or if it's sort of a pipe dream that we could, as a group, come up with ideas of the kind of things we want to see, and then have those actually get planned and enacted through whatever funding sources that we come up with as a group, which could be a variety of different funding sources. So it sounds like that's not how projects have been developed ever really on the community forest in the past. Is that a possibility?
So, I mean, I guess from the BLM perspective, I'm struggling with that's not how projects have been developed in the past, because I think we've had a variety of projects that have either come from, either the RCD or, somebody from the steering committee wanting to do a project on BLM, and also projects from the BLM, that we generate ourselves. So I think unless I'm completely off base here, kind of doing that already, although we don't have this kind of formalized process for figuring that out. I'm not opposed to this if we want to try to use that to drive the types of projects that we want to do. We just have to mesh that with what the agency is also getting pressure for as priorities. So, we're going to continue to do fuels reduction work and things like that in the community forest, kind of regardless, because, one, it's important, and two, it's an agency priority.
I agree with Jennifer. That's definitely been sort of how that process has worked. So it's not like it's not like this is all top down or anything. I think that, part of the steering committee's, process has been, like identifying those projects and then saying, well, we should, we should look at this, or we should attempt to do that. And those things have, and many of the projects that end up coming through and or are funded by the agencies, have have a lot of weight behind them already with the way that the process of the steering committee has functioned in the past. So I definitely agree that that's sort of what you're proposing is sort of how it's been happening. It's just a less formalized version of that.
This is Keith. I was just thinking that this looks very similar to some of the Fire Safe Council approaches,
yes,
where you identify and collect projects with, maybe someone's got I forget the word you use, but like a brainstorm, a real good idea that's intellectually based, and then you got to kind of vet it a little bit and see where it fits into the overall scheme. I do see a little bit of and it could be a separate approach. The AOP calls itself a financial and operating plan, and I think I see, maybe again because I'm outside coming in new, but the operation just looks like a collection or mishmash of projects categorized by the strategic plan, and I don't really see a financial listing of this is what we're going to spend in 2020 or 2021, or there needs to be a little more, it seems like a little more detail there, but I do like the idea of having some balance sheet, if you will, of costs, and then projects for sure they have to span over a longer range than just 1 year. But somewhere we have to identify what are we going to do this year, so it looks, collective, and it shows that we just don't have things in the hopper that aren't getting done. Even if we only accomplish one thing, at least show that we've got one thing we're going to do this year. Now it might change with funding. Obviously it changes every year for us with grants and things. So I do like this approach because at least it does somewhere along the line rank and be an opportunity for the collective to come up with brainstorms.
Typically, the AOP will have, some sort of generalized dollar amount, associated with a project and what it's expected to either cost or, potentially in the case of, where that funding's coming from, whether it's coming from retained receipts or things of that nature. And then they're usually, dated roughly like when we would expect them to be completed. So, those things could be basically sussed out of the AOP as to what's actually happening this particular year. But it has more oftentimes been sort of the longer reaching, like we expect it to be done by the fall of 2020, or we expect it to be done by the spring of 2021. And so those things are usually noted within the AOP, but it's definitely not, it is a pretty generalized document as far as that's concerned.
I know I have to come up with a budget every year, and I don't live and die on that budget, but at least to provide one that shows what the income is and what the outgo is, so that when we make a change, it's recognized as such.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I wanted to add on a couple of the things people have shared as far as kind of putting some sort of like general project planning in the strategic plan. Oz and I have kind of been thinking of this as like a menu of projects where we can say, like harvest is really important to the community for us. Like we need to prioritize planning some new projects like that, and potentially incorporating some financial information that's more just like cheap, moderate, expensive, and not like a dollar amount, since that would be so hard to predict without calling it a project and knowing acres and and that kind of thing. So I think, yeah, our idea has been what sounds like to kind of formalize and write down a little bit of what we're already doing, and just have all of those sort of project ideas and goals in one place ahead of time. And then I think on the AOPs, I've kind of personally been wondering too if maybe we could add an element of reporting on the previous year into them, which I think is done a little bit, but maybe that would help on all of these topics we've been discussing about accountability and making sure we're addressing objectives and the financial element. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that, but. Cool.
Have we developed, Kathleen, have we developed any reports to date that show accomplishments? I'm assuming so.
Just of community forest projects?
Correct.
Because I'm so new, I can't say specifically. I don't know yet, but I'm sure, you know, with the federal agencies and the projects that we have done on the community forest, there's been reports. I don't know if anyone else can add.
I don't know that we have like a running tally over. I mean, I think usually the way that gets reported out is on like an annual report sort of basis as to what projects may have been worked on, you know. But it's not, to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't been something that we've compiled over time, if that's what you're asking, Keith.
Yeah, it is. I'm kind of wondering what we started with and what do we have now? How many acres have we treated?
Right.
What means?
Yeah, that's a big question that I have too, Keith, and I think that's part of what I've been, part of what I'm hoping Kathleen will help with as well is compiling like a GIS database also of all the treatments that have been done of different types, so that, because there really isn't, as far as I know, a centralized place where all of that information is stored, so we don't know the treatment history of the community forest as a whole. I think a lot of that gets reported out individually to the agencies, like if we're doing things through agreements with the agencies, whoever's carrying out implementation will report to if that's RCD, or will report to the agency on a regular basis, but then that hasn't been compiled in a place where we have a database where anyone can go and see what has happened, how has the forest changed over time. We also don't have a very comprehensive monitoring program to know in very specific terms how the forest as a whole is changing over time, as far as I'm aware. So there's a lot of knowledge gaps there that I think we can start to build on and at least create the structure where we can start storing all this information in one place, and maybe go along with what Kathleen was saying as we think about the next year. Every year we can also add to that compilation of what we've actually accomplished in the past year. I also just really wanted to apologize, Jen, if I made it sound like there was never any input from the steering committee onto the projects that end up on the community forest. I guess I meant never in this way, in terms of like going through this ranking process, and I guess the more formal way. So sorry if it sounded too extreme. Wasn't my intent.
No, you're good.
Yeah,
No worries.
Hopefully that answers your question, Keith. Is that I think the answer is essentially no, but we want to work on it.
Yeah, I really think that's a great idea, because I've seen lots of individual reports of accomplishment for the trail work that we do with the RCD, but having that big list of these are the things that have occurred since the beginning of the forest, I think it would be an impressive list, and it would also help focus on what things are easily achievable as well as what things are getting missed.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. To the best of my knowledge, that's accurate.
This is Keith.
We don't have a running tally, but I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to try to begin to do that.
This is Keith. I know that I worked with the planning commission, and they had the roads department had a very large matrix that showed all the potential projects, and then they had priorities, but then they also had implementation based upon funding. A lot of times, if they could get matching funding, you get it done, whether it's the highest priority or not. We can do the same thing and mark accomplishments, and people understand why they got funded or why they got accomplished.
Yeah, it seems like our agency kind of has an avalanche approach where we don't get much done for a long time, and then some kind of magic money falls out of the sky or something. And having those shelf items on the list really makes it easy for us to put that money on the ground when it comes falling out of the sky.
Yeah, it's a great idea.
Sorry, I think I missed the beginning of your comment there. Is that who has that matrix? Is that something we could look at and learn from?
It was a planning commission, and it was a roads department up in Washington. So it's essentially the same thing you're doing, which is just you're collecting projects, and then you identify them and you rank them like the fire safe councils do, and then you get them done based upon matching funds usually.
Yeah, and one thing that we were inspired by the CWPP process. You could tell directly when we made this. But one thing that's a little different here is that we're not intending to identify, in the CWPP, it'll be fuel reduction on this acre on this particular lat and long, whereas for this, because we don't know all the updates of the management plans and what the agency priorities will be, we were thinking of keeping it a little more general, just in general, a timber harvest that meets our prescriptions that we describe in this plan. But yeah, I guess, I don't know if you have any input on that, if that is the best way to go since we have the AOPs that are more specific, or if that's going to make it harder to make this meaningful because it is a little bit vague in that way.
I guess I kind of wonder, I know that the Forest Service used to have a compartmental system where they'd say for this particular compartment of land, we want to achieve these. We have the objectives, but this is what we want to treat, how we want to treat this particular compartment. And I would assume that all the BLM land has been forest typed, and you've got some identified objectives for them, whether it's fuel reduction or how you're going to transition from one stand type to the desired future condition. Forest Service must have objectives too. So I think we probably know what we want it to look like as well. And if we could put those things together, then you got an A, B, and C for this particular compartment. Doesn't seem like too onerous of a process by developing a prescription on a land base.
Yeah, I guess maybe I just haven't seen that level of, that'd be really helpful if agencies want to weigh in on this, agency folks want to weigh in on this, but if there is that level of already defined objectives, but it sounds like maybe Jen, you were saying vague type of RMP, maybe that doesn't exist yet, but it will soon. So regardless, I think we'll have a caveat in the strategic plan saying we'll revise it once we have updated RMPs, but yeah, I guess I haven't seen anything to that degree of specificity of what you're describing, Keith. And if that exists, I would love to have it. And if not, we'll go forward without it.
So
I can.
It's okay. Go ahead.
I can. I've got a copy of the Shasta Trinity LRMP that I can bring in and let you guys use. You may have one in your library, and that shows all the compartments on the forest and what the objectives are.
Jen, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, really the closest thing that we would have is probably going to be, because the Northwest Forest Plan amended our resource management plan, so it would be any of the management type objectives out of the Northwest Forest Plan as far as stand management goes. We've got some really probably outdated forest management stuff in our old RMP, but it's not current.
Well, to me, even if you just have a stand exam of sorts, even if it's generalized, you know what you have, and then you just have to identify those desired future conditions to drive it.
Yeah, we have like Forbes data. We have like data, but I think the desired future condition piece is probably what's missing, just because we either have really old direction from our plan or, you know, as amended in the Northwest Forest Plan, but we don't have any current, the most current thing we've got is Northwest Forest Plan direction.
Well, I'm thinking that this group is about as good as any at coming up with that desired future condition, because they have specific objectives, I think, within the surrounding of the community for those forest stands.
I agree.
So it sounds like people feel that this kind of information and matrix does fit in the strategic plan. It's not too project specific. Not getting any no's, so I think that's a yes. Okay, cool. Well, that will be, I think, a fun project to work on, to include that. On that kind of topic, I was wondering if maybe people would be open to discussing like how that has differed from past strategic plans. So I know in the past, like in the original strategic plan, you know, we had some information about we're going to try to do harvests every 2 years, I think, and obviously that hasn't come to fruition. So is there lessons we've learned from not being able to implement as many harvests as we originally intended? You know, did we just encounter barriers? Was it ended up being too expensive? Just wondering what the historical knowledge on that might be.
Well, I mean, I can speak at least for the BLM for the last 10 years that I've been here. We did do, trying to remember, I think we finished one, or there was one like small harvest right when I got here, or we had just finished. But we've been in a weird kind of pattern of not having foresters for probably my first, I don't know, 4 years that we were here, that I was here, and then we only had one forester. And so I think part of the issue is we're covering 250,000 acres across 5 counties with one forester, and for the last 3 years we've been sucked into nothing but salvage sales from our fires. So I think a lot of the reason it's hard for us to get traction is just staffing. So we have to shift the model, which is kind of what's been talked about a lot, to not relying on agency staff if we want to actually have a consistent timber sale treatment. Like, it's been Heidi's priority to come get a green sale laid out, but when that gets changed for salvage sale, then all that goes out the window. So that's really been, I think, our biggest barrier has been being able to have staff to kind of run with projects.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. I think that's right, Jennifer. Like, like in those early years, especially, like after the first, in 2005, when we first had the stewardship agreement in place, and I believe we did a harvest in 2007 or 2008. And then I think the one that you're referring to, Jennifer, was the second phase. we had a lot more availability and worked much more directly with the forestry staff from the BLM field office to actually get those things laid out, working with Kenneth and Bubba for stand assessments and all that kind of stuff. But it has been more challenging over the past 10 years for sure.
Yeah, well, we've been through 3 foresters in the 10 years I've been here.
Yeah.
So that doesn't help either. I mean, just because you get somebody in, try to bring them up to speed, and then they transition. So yeah, three forester changes plus, 2 pretty large scale fires, and then we went from, at one point in time, the Reading office had 5 foresters. We're down to 1 permanent and 1 term. So that for sure doesn't help either.
And probably pretty much the same set of issues with the Forest Service side. I mean, the Browns project, which has 3 phases. I mean, the Forest Service worked on that NEPA for 10 years before it got signed in 2009, I think it was. And they're still, trying to get the contractor to finish phase 3, and he goes off on other projects. Fires seem to dominate everybody, not just the agency folks. Also, because I think the operator for the Browns phase 3 was mostly doing cleanup work over in the Paradise area for since that fire, and then he went on the August fire. So that's going to be an issue. And getting this, the Forest Service specialists are stretched really thin. And I'll say this as the facilitator of the Trinity County Collaborative. The Trinity County Collaborative has trumped the community forest as far as getting priority time from the specialists to do projects.
With the exception of the new Weaverville fuels reduction and recreation NEPA.
Right.
Perhaps.
Yeah, but that part of that is because it's a CE and it doesn't have any commercial,
and it's funded
money. And we got outside money to pay for the specialists.
Correct.
So Jen, I'm curious, given that, barring a huge change in staffing, which I'm not maybe that's happening, maybe not, and the fact that the large fires are probably not going to stop and are probably going to keep pulling a lot of attention and need for salvage and stuff like that. If we want to create, an ambitious plan to really get harvest done on the community forest, do you feel like the mechanisms are already there and are sufficient? Because obviously, even if you have a third party overseeing timber harvest or something like that, it still requires staff time to have that oversight from BLM. So I guess the questions are do you feel like the mechanisms are already there and sufficient where you can depend more on someone else to get harvest done here if we want to really focus on getting harvest done on the community forest despite your other projects? And also, are there specific project design elements that help that? For example, and you mentioned earlier something about if it's 250,000 board feet or less, then the RCD is allowed to negotiate contracts or something like that. Are there specific designs where smaller harvests or particular types of harvests make it easier to get things done just by staffing limitations?
So yeah, I think that the mechanism exists. We just have to get better at using basically good neighbor authority agreements or the stewardship contract to actually, because you almost have to have, the way we're looking at it now is we're not going to build capacity within our own staff. It's not going to happen. We've been asking for more money, for more staffing, but in reality, we've seen, like I said, about a 25% reduction in permanent full-time employees just in the 10 years I've been in field manager. So we have to find a way to fund, I think, basically, third-party contractors or the RCD or somebody to do a lot of that ground-based work. Not even at this point would include layout, timber sale design and layout, just because, I only have Heidi. And so, Heidi can't spend the amount of time it takes to do all of that. So I think we just have to figure out how that works. And I know that it still takes staff oversight and, time on my part, but that's really, it's the only mechanism I see. It'd be interesting to talk, with my, staff and see what they're thinking, but it's really the only mechanism I see for us to be, to really get a lot of project work done, in the community forest, just because, we have priorities pulling us all over the place and not a whole lot of people to address all of those.
Yeah, and then
Go ahead, Azalee.
I was just going to get follow up. So, and I know because my question has multiple parts. But to those specific design elements, does anything like that spring to mind? Because I didn't know, for example, that board foot cap on third-party contract negotiators. Is there anything else like that, Jen, that comes to mind?
No, not really. I mean, I think we have the stewardship agreements in place. We're, starting to use things like Good Neighbor Authority contracts, which help us. The board feet thing it's a kind of I don't know if it's touchy, but, it does allow us, if it's under 250,000 board feet, to do a negotiated sale. But you also then have to think about the public perception of that. So if we're always doing always only structuring our sales so we're less than 250,000 board feet, then we're not really allowing for, competition amongst other entities. And so that's always a balance there. So maybe, figuring out whether there's, some sales that make sense as less than 250 to get them done, but then obviously other sales that we would have to put through the competitive bid process just so that we're not only favoring one entity. It's kind of a fine balance there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Pat, do you have any recollection of in those two phases, the two-phased greens timber harvest that we did on BLM property? Do you remember what kind of board footage came off those two? Because I don't remember it being particularly large.
No, and I think Jennifer said that BLM was operating slightly differently then. They didn't have that limitation. And I'm sorry about the dogs.
I just don't think that they were that big.
I thought 400,000 board feet, maybe. Something like that. 400,000, 500,000.
Each?
They were big. We have the same limitations. We just weren't.
That's what I'm saying. You just weren't operating with them.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be kind to your predecessor.
Thanks, Pat.
But I think, and the other thing is, the funding to lay those out, that, RCD was able to hire Kenneth and Bubba to do the field work to lay out those jobs. And the first one actually was funding from the Resource Conservation and Development Council that paid Bubba to do that, lay out the first project. And BLM allowed us.
Are you sure about that? Are you sure about that, Pat? I think they paid us to do that initial permanent plot inventory to see if it was feasible for the community to purchase the property. I don't know that they paid for the layout of the first sale.
I think they did. I think it was a separate pot of money later. And then the second project, the second harvest that you guys laid out, we actually were able to use retained receipts from the first harvest to accomplish that one.
Yeah, that's my memory, and I actually laid that out myself. That wasn't Bubba.
Yeah, okay. So, it's a combination. So, getting third party, help to do NEPA, and specialist work, I think is a step in the right direction, but you also still have to have funding to do that. The same funding limitation, which means that the BLM and the Forest Service have fewer staff, are the same funding limitations that make it more difficult to use third-party people. So you got to be looking for other ways to fund that.
Correct. And most of this is going to be really in the weeds, but most of our projects that we have been doing on BLM land come from a fund known as 5900. It's the money that allows us to do project work.
Right.
There was a adjustment in 5900. It used to be just for salvage work only, and then they made an addition to it, I don't know, quite a few years ago that allowed for that money to be used for green sales and salvage. Somehow in this administration, they allowed that addendum for green sales to lapse this year. So now there's no 5900 funds available for green sales, only salvage.
Wow.
And that's where the bulk of our money for implementation outside of, salvage money, yes, but any of our, Grass Valley Creek and a lot of that money has been coming out of those 5900 funds. And as of this year, so fiscal year 21, at least for BLM, 5900 can no longer be used for green sales, which seems to go completely backwards in the whole, we need to treat the forests, what we've been saying.
That blows my mind.
Yeah, well, weren't you given direction to put out more timber sales?
Yes, we were, but I don't know where the money's going to come from because our forestry money comes in two pots. 1030 money, which is typically, pays for labor, it basically pays for Heidi. And then all of our implementation money typically comes in at 5900. But this year, the Reading office is only getting a very small amount of 5900, and that's to finish the implementation of the campfire salvage. But we're getting no 5900 money to start implementing any green sales. So
interesting.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So we're gonna. So I think we're gonna have to get creative in how we use our fuels money. That we get and work with Rob to figure out how we lay out projects that meet fuels fuels requirements and fuels objectives, but also have a timber component. We're gonna have to look at that, and then also outside or wildlife or other funding, because there's not, at least at this point, any actual green sale layout money coming until somebody figures out how to fix it.
I remember those initial two phases on BLM were titled fuels reduction projects. They weren't, I don't think they were, I remember them specifically being talked about as such, even back then.
Yep.
Yeah, well, I think it was fuel reduction forest health project.
Yeah.
Well, I've got a proposal just off the top of my head. I don't know if this will help in any way, but if you want to do another sale on BLM, I would do all the layout work and defer getting paid until the retained receipts came in from the harvest.
I was going to suggest, Kenneth, that you volunteer your time on a weekend and this is
Hey, the problem with that is
that's and you're agreeing to help, Keith?
You guys are going to tag team, right?
You're a good tag team. You're right there in the watershed.
Bring a high school kid out. We'll show them how to use a roll of flaggy.
Well, we've talked about that, because there's a really good high school forestry program at Trinity High School. And we really ought to be using that somewhere else on this agenda, but we really ought to be getting them out in the woods using the community forest as their classroom.
Yeah, and that seems like something that we might, like as an education outreach component of this, that we could get with Elizabeth on, and that Trinity Together Cradle to Career thing, program. I think that would fall right in line.
Yeah,
So
Elizabeth
Professor
and I.
Kenneth can lead the class.
Oh, I'd love to do that.
Awesome. Elizabeth and I think, have definitely been churning a lot of gears on getting kiddos involved and Shasta College and trying to figure out how to get people in the forest and develop programs for that. So that is definitely going to be part of our education and outreach objective. But unless people have things to add on this, it is 11 o'clock. We've been here for 2 hours, and I'm sure several of us could talk a lot of the rest of the day on improving our forest, but I don't want to
name names.
I don't want to kidnap everyone. But yeah, this has been super helpful and informative, and we'll try to roll over some of these other things into our next meeting, and maybe kind of homework assignments. I'll send a follow-up email for to keep people commenting and engaged before the next meeting. But does anybody have any closing thoughts?
Well, thanks for all the energy and effort that you and Owsley have put into this. It's really a good start.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks all for your time, because I think, this was actually it's probably one of the most productive, I think, committee meetings that we've actually had, as far as getting some strong guidance and some strong direction as to, where we should be, moving forward with this. So, thanks to Kathleen and to Owsley for spearheading it, and thanks for all of your participation. Very much appreciated.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Thank you all for being involved and volunteering this time.
Yeah, can't thank you enough for your time.
Okay, I'm going to breakfast.
Have a good brunch, Kenneth.
Bye.
I'm going to go cut a tree down.
Bye.
All right, bye everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.